You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
Because of the following special program, Wonder Woman and the Incredible Hulk will not be presented this evening.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Making Tracks. Here are your hosts, Mark Newbold and Mark Mulcaster.
That's not true. That's impossible.
Hello there, and welcome to our final part of our Obi-Wan Kenobi reaction chat, brought to you by those fine folk over at fanthatracks.com. This is your spoiler warning, and we intend to trample all over the plot and give our thoughts and reactions to everything we've seen in part 6 of Obi-Wan Kenobi. So, if you haven't seen the episode yet and you want to remain spoiler-free, then hit the pause button and come back when you have. You have been warned. Part 5 gave us some answers to some questions. We witnessed Reva being double-crossed by Darth Vader and the returning Grand Inquisitor. After it was exposed, she wasn't hunting Obi-Wan Kenobi, but in fact, the Dark Lord of the Sith. Having been impaled by her own blade at the hands of Darth Vader, Reva finds a garbled message pointing her towards Owen Lars and Tatooine. Obi-Wan and Leia and the surviving members of the Hidden Path manage to narrowly escape Vader's clutches and make it off-planet, only to find a hyperspace drive malfunctioning, and with the Empire hot in pursuit, where will they go next? It's not even 10 AM on a Wednesday morning, and so diving right in to discuss this 51-minute long finale is Fantha Tracks' golden boy, Mark Newbold. Mark, welcome back to the show. Let's kick off right away with your overall thoughts on this episode.
Really, where do you start? So much in this to chew over, so much to take in, but my first reaction was, that was the first episode that genuinely got me emotional. There was moments in that where I was right back in 2005 in Revenge of the Sith territory on Mustafar. There was moments in that where I was back in that room in 2017 when John Williams came out and played Princess Leia's theme. There was bits that were thrilling, bits that were, as we said last week, kind of on the borderline of Force Unleashed, but also plenty of moments where you could see the pieces being moved around. It's a delicate jigsaw puzzle that they're pulling together. So there was part element of that was just incredible, and other parts of like, that was functional, but I get why you did what you did. So lots to talk about, but my ultimate reaction is they left the best till last. That was my favourite episode of all 6.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That was pretty awesome. I mean, there was a lot of time spent with Obi-Wan versus Vader, which is like, I think whenever we're going to get something like that, you know, they spend a lot of time and focus on it. But also, actually, what was really nice was, you know, how much time they actually spent with Owen and Beru in this episode. You know, it gave us, I think, a really different perspective to what we think that we know of Owen and Beru, because we don't really know much about them, really. And just seeing kind of change of perspective was really interesting. But yeah, I mean, generally overall, it was a thrilling end to the series and ties up nicely. But also, I think it does leave us a little bit open to a second season, which in this day and age is only to be expected, really, and not necessarily a bad thing.
That's definitely the case. I mean, if they don't ever do anything else again, then they've left it with certain cues. You know, Ben has stepped away, he's leaving Owen and Beru to raise Luke. He's got the Skyhopper in his hand. You know, there's lots of little functional things like that. Leia, we now knows Obi-Wan well. There's that sequence there. So there's lots of little bits that if you didn't ever go back to it, we always thought the last time they fought was on Mustafar, and then a couple of weeks ago it was at Mapuzo. Now it's on this new planet they land on with Ben in the shuttle and Vader in the Tidarium shuttle. There's little moments like that that work really well, but by the same token, I know we're stepping all over the episode chronologically, but Qui-Gon at the very end reappearing, you know, there's more to investigate there if you want to do it. And that's a promise made by Yoda that he would teach him how to commune, and Leia calling him Obi-Wan. Just lots of little bits like that work very, very well.
This series can definitely be the rise of Obi-Wan Kenobi. You know, it's him getting his mojo back, but it's not just getting his mojo back. I think it's finding his place and his purpose a little bit more from what he's seen from Owen and Beru and how they were able to protect Luke from Reva. It gives, I would imagine, him hope that, yeah, he can distance himself. And even potentially now this could open up a whole second series where Obi-Wan doesn't need to necessarily worry about Luke, but there could be other things. There could be other people that could need saving on Tatooine or other planets. let's assume that he keeps that ship. So therefore, that's opened that avenue up, which is something that not necessarily we would have thought about. Because of what we've seen through the series, it makes the idea of actually having Obi-Wan go off planet and take a break, shall we say, from his vigil on Tatooine. And I think that's where I think we kind of get our wires crossed as fans, is because I think, for lack of a better term, I almost feel like what we thought Obi-Wan did was exactly what the Black Watch does in Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
They just have this vigil on top of a wall. They don't take wives, they don't do anything, they just freeze their butts off. And, you know, he's there burning his butts off, shall we say, on the desert, watching Luke grow up. And now we know that isn't the case, and that doesn't necessarily need to be the case. And it gives us like a whole wider open story narrative for Obi-Wan to develop even more than what we've, you know, seen so far, which I think means that this series has worked on that level.
And it goes back to things we've been saying on the main show and on Reaction Chat about headcanon and how certain things you just feel like you know it, but when you actually drill into it a little bit, there's a lot of open space in what was said, especially in A New Hope. And so we make assumptions and we get it fixed in our heads. You know, just the meeting on Alderaan at the end, talk about a flying visit. It's not an unsubstantial distance from Tatooine to Alderaan, so that's a hell of a hop. But nevertheless, the speech with Bail, if you need me, call me. Obi-Wan Kenobi's back in the room. I think that's what this show has almost done. In a weird way, I think we expected, and there's been a lot of very pleasant subverting of expectation, not button-pushing subverting of expectation like other stories may have done, but very pleasant ones. Like we expected the focus to be on Luke, and we see a little bit more of Luke in this, and I hope we see more of him. But we got Leia, and that made all the sense. And in this one, I think we thought, well, now we're going to learn how Obi-Wan Kenobi turned into Ben Kenobi, and that would set you up for A New Hope. And actually, what we learned was we walked straight into Ben Kenobi, battered, tired Ben Kenobi, and watched Obi-Wan Kenobi re-emerge from the shell of this man that was lost in the desert. So that wasn't what we expected either. So I kind of like that. We're now left with a man with purpose once again, but he's got a bit of perspective on the whole scenario. He didn't have the perspective at the start that he has at the end, because Leia, his task was Luke. And now he's realised that Leia is obviously every bit as important in her position, and he knows Leia. He doesn't really know Luke. He only really meets Luke at the very end, but he knows Leia. So that's changed the game as well. So lots of twists and tweaks on what we thought. One, what we thought we would get, but two, what we assumed we'd get. They've turned it around and made it, I think, really interesting.
I like what we're seeing from Ben in this episode. Once we have this initial opening scene of Reva back on Tatooine in Mos Eisley, we kind of enter this kind of on the nose kind of homage to the chase off of Hoth from The Empire Strikes Back, with the Hidden Path ship and like Star Destroyer chasing them. And, you know, it's fair that we see Obi-Wan making that altruistic decision of saying, look, no, let me take the brunt of their force now. You know, if they're not after you guys, if I split from you guys, they're going to follow me, and you're going to be able to make it onto safety. You know, that's probably the most Jedi thing that I think we've seen him do.
There was a moment in that sequence where the two ships go their separate ways, and it was very telling, because we've seen Rebels and we know his MO, that the Inquisitor was like, now's our chance to stamp out this cell, which we know was a big focus for him in Rebels. And Vader's like, no, I want that ship, which was his big focus in the original trilogy. So you had two opposing sort of opinions and ways of doing business right at that fork in the road, and Vader, being the boss, turns the other way, and the Inquisitor just gives that kind of look like, okay, you're the boss.
This is Steve Bloom, voice of Zebralios, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks. Caravast. May the Force be with you.
That's that upper management, you know, shop floor kind of mentality. Well, you can make a decision, but actually it's not going to work out how you think it is. And actually it doesn't. It takes us to this planet that gave me vibes of Iradu from Rogue One, just for kind of like the stone structure and that, and it was nice and dark and that. But that opening scene of Vader landing on the, you know, and walking out, it felt almost like they'd just replicated what happened on the end of Last Jedi between Kylo Ren and Luke, because it was shot on the volume and stuff, and it had a very similar kind of stage, and it was very similarly composed, the shots and stuff. At one point I was like, oh my god, this is Ben back, and actually we're cut to Ben somewhere else, and you've got Qui-Gon there teaching him how to kind of force project or something. But I mean, that could have been cool. We didn't get that, but what we ended up getting was like part one of like a very kick-ass battle.
It was. I think when we spoke last on the last reaction chat, we was thinking, maybe there'll be like a 3-way or a 4-way, you know, Reva, the Inquisitor, Vader and Ben going at it. Thankfully, having seen what we've seen, it wasn't that at all. It was very much a case of this is these two guys squaring off, settling their differences in a kind of a samurai or an old Western shoot-off type way. Did look a bit like Edu, and it reminded me a little bit of Exegol, and it was just sort of hinting at stuff, and the framing of it, like you say, was like on Crate at the end of Last Jedi, so there's lots of little cues that made you think, there's something familiar about this, but going into it, knowing that this wasn't their final battle, but in terms of the two being on some sort of equal level in terms of power and strength, it probably was. It struck me that by this time, and we keep using the phrase about Ben getting his mojo back, Ben got his mojo back, and Vader was the one that was clearly unbalanced. You know, he's angry, he's thrown off, he's not properly on his game. And even though, I mean, it's an amazing fight, some of the moments in there, Ben twirling the saber behind his back, there was the moment that even had me sort of sitting, leaping out my seat. It was like, that was like a Phantom Menace move. That was amazing. Vader gets the upper hand, buries him under the rocks. We kind of get to that, as we've described, as that Force Unleashed territory, because he's holding the rocks up. But there were some fantastic sequences in that fight.
Absolutely. I mean, I loved how we've had this kind of running gag for the whole of this series, whereby they're talking about like, oh, you know, Jedi just make rocks float. We kind of had this in a sequel trilogy as well. And we basically end up with a battle between Vader and Kenobi where they are literally just pelting each other with like sides of mountains and all these massive boulders. Yeah. I mean, if you want to get meta about that kind of description, then that's basically it. And, you know, I mean, if they had just made it about one little bit bigger, a little bit more fantastical, I think I would have probably gone, yeah, that's almost jumping the shark a little bit, but it was just on the right line. Yeah. I mean, obviously it's harder because you kind of think, well, if Vader could do that against Obi-Wan, could he not have done that, you know, against Luke in Cloud City and that? But then you can go, well, actually, no, because the whole point was that Vader didn't want to kill Luke. Yeah. At no point has Vader wanted to kill Luke. He's wanted to bring him over to the dark side. You know, you don't want to unleash the beast, as it were, and then find that you've annihilated your prize. But with Obi-Wan, annihilation is the aim of the game. Yet, however, he's basically buried him. And then rather than kind of check for signs of life or hang around for any time, he just walks off. Yeah. And as we can see, Obi-Wan's underneath, you know, amazingly holding those rocks up in place using the Force.
Like Reaver last week, he should have finished Reaver off and didn't. But then I think after the conversation that they have, when Ben gets out and goes primal on him with the rocks, and there was it was almost like a melee attack as well, you know, which is attacking Anakin or Vader and slashing this saber back and getting him on the back foot. He hammers at his chest plate with the hilt of his saber to smash up his chest plate, and just lots of physical attacks that you associate way more with Anakin. Anakin, when he's fighting in Revenge of the Sith, he's hitting Obi under the chin, he's kicking him, you know, there's constantly physical movements in amongst the lightsaber fights. And in this fight, it was Ben that was doing that. So it was like Ben had learned from Anakin's aggression, but used it in a focused way. I love that. But one moment in that I think will cause equal parts consternation and equal parts delight was when Ben slashes at Vader, takes the helmet out, and reveals the face of Anakin. I think anybody who watched Rebels back in the day will just immediately go, well, that's what Ahsoka did. That was a little bit jarring in that we've seen this move before. And chronologically, this is before that happens, of course. But nevertheless, it is something Star Wars fans have seen before. But once they went at it and started fighting, I could only see two ends. Either Ben was going to chop off the arms and legs that he chopped off before and just leave him on the ground, you know, which would really fuel his hate. Or there would be that literally they see each other's face and they have that moment. What did you think of that moment? I've got my thoughts on that moment. What did you make of that exchange between the two?
Because of what we saw in Rebels, and it sounds bizarre because, you know, people go, oh, you know, Rebels was a cartoon, but it was Ahsoka seeing Anakin's face behind a mask, and that was equally as powerful. And the way it was done, and especially at the time, we didn't know where we were going to get Kenobi. So it was something that I'd kind of seen before, which was a bit of a shame because I think I then didn't get the full emotional impact from that moment. But then going on and having that conversation, and it's clear, it's just like Obi-Wan, up to that point, could not finish him. I loved how they basically destroyed Vader again. You know, he kind of like, his chest box gets destroyed, and suddenly you can hear like the wheezing like we hear in Return of the Jedi. He gets like a shot in the back, so he's not being able to move around properly, and then obviously half the helmet gets destroyed, and you kind of go, wow, you know, Obi-Wan should just finish him there, but he just cannot do it. Yeah. And I just loved how they have that conversation, and you've got Ben Kenobi apologizing, saying, I'm sorry for doing this to you. And I think to be fair, a real human kind of thing to say. You would think that somebody as good as Obi-Wan, even though you've committed all these atrocities, the actual emotional resonance that you have to that person is probably going to be borne out, and you're going to apologize for basically doing it.
Yeah.
But what was so cool was just seeing how Anakin was like, no, it was Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader that put me into this, into where I am now. It's because Anakin was weak and Darth Vader's evil and strong. So I thought that was a really, really well scripted and really powerful moment.
It was an interesting moment of self-awareness as well, because at the end, when the Emperor's hologram came, just to say, technically that surprised me, not seeing the Emperor, but the fact that they didn't make him look anything like the Emperor from the original trilogy era. That just looked like Ian McDiarmid from Rise of Skywalker to me. That surprised me.
There was a bit of makeup, but it wasn't particularly, it was almost like, oh yeah, people need to see that it's Ian McDiarmid and not somebody else. Yeah. And I was just like, oh, come on, the execution was just a little bit off. It almost looks like what they've done is, and they've tried to make extra attention to kind of like, yes, he's got to have a cowl of a cloak, but yeah, we need to be able to see the eyes and stuff like that. So it didn't quite work. And I think it's just down to the lighting probably more than anything.
At the end, Vader completely pledges himself to the Emperor. I only serve you, my master. But when he's speaking to Kenobi, Ben says, I'm so sorry. And he's filling up, basically. He's seen his old friend again face to face for the first time since Mustafar. It's the first time he's seen his face. And he hasn't got the Sith eyes in that moment. Next time we see him, he has. His anger's rising up again. But when he sees that, and Anakin, like you say, says, well, no, you didn't do this to me. Anakin does this to me. It feels like the last human moment, not only for Ben, but also for Anakin, because it's almost like, you could read it, I read it like he's almost not forgiving him, but absolving him of the blame. Anakin's self-aware enough to go, no, I made all the choices here. I chose to follow a path that would save Padme because I'd lost my mother, and I'm the one that got stooged. It feels like a moment of self-awareness for Anakin. And I'm saying Anakin, not Vader, because Vader kind of kicks back in. You hear the James Earl Jones voice take over again, and then that scream at the end, the yell at the end. So all of those elements I thought were really neatly played, to the point that when Ben walks away, he calls him Darth, which hurls you back to the fight on the Death Star. You can't win, Darth. And you're always like, why does he call him Darth? That's not his first name. That's his title. It's because you've had that moment of the two having some sort of understanding, as tenuous as it is. And at the end of it, Darth Vader comes back into prevalence, if you want to call it that. Like you said, it's two heavyweight boxers that can't land the killer punch. They've kind of got a respect for each other because they're killers. I thought there was a lot of nuance in that scene.
I think it's a lot more subtle than people maybe give it credit for, actually, which I think comes down to the acting, direction, and also Joby Harold's scripting as well. But that does kind of then raise a question, actually. If we then go on to, let's say, an Obi-Wan Kenobi season 2, or perhaps we don't, and we actually now get a Darth Vader series, are we ever likely to get to that point whereby Obi-Wan could kill Vader? Do you think that's actually a possibility? Not from a skill perspective, but purely from like an emotional perspective. By the time we get to New Hope, he's basically playing for time. Yeah. And he's holding Vader up. But yet you kind of think, how many more times could they meet and Kenobi realistically walk away, basically pull his punches and not actually, deliver the killing blow? From what we've seen so far, I don't ever think, until Obi-Wan gets to that older age that we see him in A New Hope, I don't ever think that Vader will be able to get the better of him.
No. There's moments in this fight when every other time you've seen him use his sabre in this series, he's been one-handed, like the Empire Kirshner thing, showing his dominance and power. In this fight, he's fighting two-handed because Ben's really coming on strong. So to that point, I think if they had a rematch in a year's time, he's probably back at that point. And now he's communing with Qui-Gon, so he's going to be learning more stuff, which you kind of think, if he'd have had the chance, he would have imparted more to Luke. But of course, we know exactly what he taught Luke in A New Hope because we saw it, or the bulk of it anyway, other than like one session of sitting on the Falcon flying to Alderaan, or what's left of it. That was really the bulk of his lessons, but it was handing him off to Yoda. So, you get to a season 2 and you think, well, if they meet again, I almost feel like they'd need to contrive it to be a bit like Wrath of Khan, when they're kind of, Khan and Kirk never meet. I kind of feel like now they've had this moment with Anakin literally facing off against Obi-Wan with the mask broken and stuff. How could you hope to top that? What else could they say that would add anything to that? I'm sure they could think of something, but you're on thin ice then, because, you're starting to think, well, it was enough with Ben meeting Luke at the end. And again, it's headcanon, But you kind of think, oh, Ben's always kept his distance and protected him from a long way away. Here they are. Hello there. Literally meeting face to face. Meeting Leia's totally different scenario. Probably not one a lot of us had considered, but it makes all the sense because it adds layers to what we know in A New Hope. And also, just as an aside, there was always that scene on the Falcon leaving the Death Star when Ben's been killed. And a lot of people said, look at Leia. Leia's just lost her entire planet and her adopted mother and father. And when you think of it in that framework, you think, well, Leia's much more worldly wise than Luke. Hardly probably ever left Tatooine. If at all, this might be the first time he's ever left planet, for all we know. He's met this warrior. He's suddenly learnt that there's this whole other world out there, and he's learnt about the Force and all these things. And all of a sudden it's ripped away. And so Luke's thinking, I've lost my chance at being somebody. Maybe I do have to go and become a TIE fighter pilot to see the galaxy, that kind of thing. Now we realise that Leia not only lost her planet and her adopted parents, we now know of this really intense, quite intense bond between Leia and Obi-Wan Kenobi we knew nothing about in Star Wars, and it doesn't take anything away from that moment in A New Hope. In fact, I would say it adds to it in a positive way, so paying it forward, if you like, into the story going ahead.
I think even just seeing Obi-Wan on Alderaan, for example, and maybe this is a subtle hint towards Obi-Wan's connection to the Force, and maybe even to Alderaan when Alderaan gets destroyed. Because, for example, we know there's millions of planets in the galaxy, and there's these catastrophic catastrophes, being natural disasters or industrial or man-made or whatever, probably happen throughout the galaxy all the time. Yet, I don't get that kind of a feeling that every time something like that happens, Obi-Wan almost kind of doubles over and kind of goes, oh my God. But I think maybe because he's obviously been to Alderaan and maybe he goes there more than once for the next 10 years, and maybe even he sees Leia kind of grow up a little bit. Again, not necessarily so in her face, but more remotely, he might then now have that more emotional connection. So that's why when they do destroy Alderaan, he kind of feels like that. The whole scene, for me, that whole scene is just brilliant, just by the fact that the ship lands, and we've had that really poignant moment where Leia's put on the holster, Tala's holster and that, and she's got on her little gloves and stuff. You get that acceptance by the mother, who kind of ain't starting to understand that whatever her daughter has gone through has clearly changed her, and is kind of going to have to kind of roll with it and, accept those changes. Yeah. But then Obi-Wan comes down with ship, so you expect a big kind of like, oh my God, it's Obi-Wan kind of moment. But yet, straight to Lola. Yeah. And it's just like, kids, how thick are they kids? Don't worry about the adult who's basically risked his life for the last, 6 episodes. Worry about the freaking droid that almost got you killed in the last one. Go figure.
For people who watch Rebels, especially Rebels and Rogue One as well, you almost start to think, well, there's different characters who, I'm thinking of Falcon really, Ahsoka and Bail and characters like that, keystone parts of this growing rebellion against the Empire that's out there but scattered. And I think one of the key things about Rebels, which is why the Inquisitor's opinion in that moment on the Star Destroyer was so important, there's all these cells, and Rebels was about pulling them, or starting to pull them together into some sort of unified rebellion. And the Inquisitor's a key part of that. And you've got to imagine over the next sort of 5 years until you get to Rebels Season 1, of course he dies at the end of that there will be moments along the way where he gets involved trying to stamp these things out. Bail is a key part of that, and Alderaan is a key part of that, increasingly to the point where it's got a bullseye on its back. And so there's all these little elements that start to fold that, like you say, means that it's quite possible now that Ben is... Because I think Ben needed to feel comfortable and confident that he could leave Luke with Owen and Beru. And like you say, they just stood up against, not a Sith Lord, but powerful Dark Force user. They stood up against her. She was injured, of course, we know that. But, they stood up against her and put up a fight and gave Luke the time to run, a bit like the start of Rogue One, where Jyn has to run. Almost fatalistic, like almost what will be will be. There's only so much we can do. And I think it's a lot of it feels like it's Ben accepting that other people can help. Ben accepting that he can't control everything, even though he hasn't really tried. No. Just that there's other players in the game. He's gone off planet for the first time, probably the first time in a decade, and seen that the state of the galaxy to a certain degree, and it's given him resolve. But he can't fight this alone.
For everything in one location, daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video, and social media feeds, bookmark FanthaTracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
We know that Obi-Wan probably more realistic as to what it's going to take to defeat Darth Vader and start to overthrow the Empire a little bit. And so I think this is almost like a small little seed that is hopefully going to germinate into obviously the Rebel Alliance. So it'd be interesting if we're going to then get some kind of hints or crossovers into the Andor series, perhaps. It's almost like it felt like the Kenobi series is going to be its own separate thing, and it's going to be a bubble, and it's not necessarily going to maybe have a larger impact on galactic events. But actually now, because he seems to be a little bit more kind of happy to go off planet and stuff like that, and he's kind of found his kind of sense of purpose a little bit more now, there's now that opportunity where actually, Obi-Wan potentially start fighting the Empire in ways that we haven't actually even considered before, which I think is quite an interesting point.
Yeah, he's totally back in the game. And it just strikes me that, you look back to episode 4, and episode 4 is A New Hope, and you wonder what the New Hope is. And is the New Hope Luke? Is the New Hope? Wasn't Leia, because when they wrote A New Hope, Leia and Luke weren't brother and sister, so you can't claim that. But was the New Hope Luke, or was the New Hope destroying the Death Star? You can look at different. There's different perspectives on that. You look at this now, and they've not given any of these episodes a title. But you could almost look at Part 6, and if you were going to give Part 6 a title, you'd look at young Luke and young Leia, and you'd call it A New Hope, because it kind of feels like Ben has given, you know what I mean? Like Leia's there.
Or even Return of the Jedi.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's very clever. I mean, we're only 10 years past the Clone Wars, and we're 10 years ahead, or 9 years ahead of Star Wars. But you're looking at the next generation. It always felt like Star Wars was where the next generation came in, but you've never looked at it from Ben's perspective. And now you're looking at the galaxy from Ben's perspective, who's been away from it for 10 years, and he's seen everything and been everywhere. Even prior to the Clone Wars, with Qui-Gon, all the stuff that he would have done, how well-travelled that guy would be. And he comes back to it, and now he sees that Leia, he's met Leia, he knows Leia, he can kind of see a path for her. And also, Bale, what a great dad Bale is. I mean, really, you don't get enough time with the two of them, but you can clearly see Jimmy Smits just does such a good job of quite clearly he's the most encouraging, nurturing dad. It's almost like quietly behind her back, let's go and do this, let's go and learn that or whatever. But also Luke with Owen and Beru living a totally different life, an honest life, if you want to call it that, a working life. As long as they're there for him, which of course they are, until A New Hope, that he's protected and safe. And you're not going to have people with red lightsabers turning up at the homestead that often. You're going to have Tusken raids, like Owen says, or Tusken raiders attacking the encampments. That's a more logical threat to Luke. And clearly, from what we've seen, Owen and Beru would make a good fist of protecting him from that.
It helps us define the difference is between Luke and Leia in terms of their upbringing. Because really, you go into A New Hope and she's called Princess Leia, but there's no real concept of princess of who, of what, of where. She could be a princess of a village for all we know. But actually now we've started to lay those seeds and actually develop both characters' backgrounds in ways which doesn't trample so much, I don't think, on what we get from them in the OT, but actually just kind of helps to give us more material to work with when we start to look at these characters again and approach them.
I'm Anthony Daniels, and you are listening to Fantha Tracks. Well done.
Let's turn our attention a little bit now to Reva, because Reva has basically in this episode operated completely by herself. She goes into Mos Eisley at the beginning and she's looking for Owen, and then we have that scene kind of in the junk dealers where Owen and Luke are in there and the guy kind of runs in and kind of like got something bad to tell you. What have you made of Reva in this episode? And, what's your thoughts about the conclusion to her story arc in this series?
Yeah, it was a weird one with Reva. It served a purpose thematically, story-wise. You needed a threat to Luke. We knew there was going to be a threat to Luke from the end of the last episode, but you needed that sort of threat. But it did feel a little, not hollow, but she's clearly lived a life, a decade of being indoctrinated into the Inquisitor program and all the stuff that happens there. And by the way, the other Inquisitors just seem to have disappeared. They just dropped off the radar completely. I thought that was a bit odd. I don't think she's fully organised in her mind about what she wants to do when she gets there. Who she's serving, it seems unclear. It never quite felt right at any point. The moment when she's got Luke, when he sort of falls down the rocks and he's knocked out and she's ready to kill him, that made some sense of sort of flashing back to her scenario. Even the end bit, when she had the blade in her hand at the end, and Ben was saying, it's up to you what you do next, and she had that blade. I said to Ruth as we were watching it together, she's gonna commit. She's doing Harry Carey here. She's committing suicide.
I thought exactly that. Yeah. Or I don't, and it's not a negative way of me thinking. I hope she did. No. But I kind of was like, I feel like there needed to be some statement there. Really, I mean, Moses Ingram's performance when she comes back, you know, and she collapses on the floor and she's next to Obi-Wan, I thought was brilliant. And the acting from her isn't at fault here at all. I think it's almost like they got to Tatooine and then were like, how are we going to pull this off without killing either of the moisture farmers, or they wanted from early doors to keep Reva in play for subsequent series.
Yeah.
Which I can understand. This is ongoing franchise kind of like lands now, so no one's ever going to die, I don't think. Bearing in mind she's been such an integral part of this whole series, and she's really driven a lot of the reasons why Obi-Wan and Leia have had to make moves and move from planet to planet. I just think that they kind of fell really short by delivering a satisfying ending to her story, or at least her story arc in this series. And irrespective of what she goes on to in another show, it has to feel satisfying for these 6 episodes. And I think, unfortunately, this is probably the least satisfying part of this episode.
Yeah, it's the only character resolution that I sort of raise an eyebrow at because, and again, you go to what probably still is the greatest reveal in cinema history. No, I am your father. And if too many people know Anakin Skywalker and Darth Vader is the same guy, it kind of pulls something from that moment, I think. And so we know that Reva knows. Reva figured that out. And again, it's Ben sparing someone. That was almost felt like a moment of, you've just kind of spared Vader when you had him at your mercy. Now you've spared another lightsaber-wielding Darksider because they've regretted their actions and turned. Not that I'm expecting Ben to kill her in the moment or anything, but just something didn't quite stack up there. They made this as a one-off limited series. I think there's so much at the end where they've kind of, like Roken, clearly he's a character that you think, well, maybe there'll be an animated series come off the back of this about a rebel cell, and Roken will turn up in that. They did that quite nicely with Fennec Shand, didn't they? You saw her at the start of or earlier in her career, and now you're seeing her post-Jedi.
The character's got potential to go on to have her own series or, you know, stories from that, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because I think it kind of comes back to something that, you know, we've been talking about for a while, and I think even Taika Waititi kind of brings up in an article like this week about how, like, you need to start creating and expanding Star Wars with new characters rather than just mining the backstories and the untold bits that we haven't seen of characters we currently know. And I think potentially that could be where maybe the wealth and actually the potential of Reva as a character goes on. But for this story and for this series, for example, I mean, I didn't necessarily feel like she was that bothered by her injury other than maybe once in that battle. I didn't necessarily feel like she was hampered enough whereby she could get waylaid by 2 moisture farmers. And absolute massive props to Bonnie Peace and to Beru, because clearly she is the one who runs that homestead. You can tell that, like, the moment things start to get a little bit heated and stuff, she's the one who's kind of snapping her fingers and making sure that Owen knows what he needs to do. And I thought that was a really nice change that we wouldn't have necessarily seen. You know, even with a lightsaber, she should have been able to, you know, take down Owen. I don't quite understand why she just didn't just kind of cut him off when he was on that bridge. Other than the fact, obviously, we need him for the next 10 years or so. I guess that is possibly where we start to find the weaknesses or potentially the writing problems that you're going to have if you bring some of these characters in from the OT that need to stay alive. You know, you want to put them in cool and dangerous positions, but then how dangerous really are they? Because we know they're going to survive. Yeah,
it's a tough balance. I mean, you look at the original trilogy, there's a lot that if you dig into it just a bit too much, a lot doesn't quite stack up. And it's got by on goodwill to a degree and start telling too many stories within the time period. And I think they've got away with it with Kenobi for the most part. You risk undermining moments in the OT. You should be bolstering and adding layers to the OT, like learning more about Leia only helps. Learning more about prior relationships adds depth. That's fine. But when you start doing things that you look at moments and go, I don't quite work anymore, that's the risk. So I think to do what Taika's saying and let's step away from this time period because it's the Star Wars galaxy and it's a long time ago. And if we step forward 50 years or back 50 years before Phantom, let's say, okay, you're going to be seeding stuff. You're going to be leading up to stuff like this leads up to Star Wars. All right, I say it leads up to Star Wars. If you think about it, it's leading up to the Rebels episode when Kenobi and Maul have a battle. That's got to be accounted for as well. You do see Ben between this and A New Hope, so there is other stuff going on, but nevertheless, yeah, they do have to be careful. I do think they've got away with it, but Reva's the one where they've really got to have something clever planned for her. Either she is, like you say, on the run from Inquisitors in a future storyline, or she joins the rebellion and goes all in and does change her spots. But you've got to wonder how indoctrinated she is. Is this temporary? Is this permanent? That's for another story writer to tell, though, isn't it?
I'm sure we're going to start to see some news of Reva probably fairly soon, I would think. And to be honest, I'm certainly not going to really have any issues. I think I'd quite look forward to see actually what happened to the character going further on. I suppose it's always that thing, isn't it? And we do sometimes forget, and series like Kenobi doesn't necessarily help us remember that it is a big galaxy. And so there's potential for people to just go and hide away and have their own little stories in different corners of the galaxy that may not necessarily ever anybody will hear about other than people on that planet or that sector. There's scope for her to just kind of go and bury herself and do something a little bit different.
Hi, this is George Mann, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
So, Mark, if you were to describe Kenobi to somebody who hasn't seen any of the series, how would you describe it to people now that we've seen all 6 parts?
I'm glad we got to see Ewan and Hayden back in those roles, and Bonnie Peace and Joel Edgerton and, the returning actors. I'm really glad we got to see them at the sort of the midway point between their iterations of the character in the prequel trilogy and where Bill Brown and Sheila Fraser and Alec Guinness and all those people originated the characters in A New Hope. So I'm glad we've got to see that because it's given us more depth. In terms of the history of Star Wars, the story and where people are, I think that's been fantastic. I think they've just skirted the line of not taking Ben away for any old reason. It was a very focused reason, giving us Leia, showing us Bail, showing us Alderaan. All those elements has been fantastic. So if I was trying to sell somebody on it, I would say, if you've watched Revenge of the Sith and you think the next thing I should watch should be Bad Batch, I would say, yeah, great, watch Bad Batch. It's fantastic. But if you want to pick up from those specific characters, because I think Bad Batch picks up the situation of the galaxy more, but this picks up the characters that we've sort of left at the end of the film. This is where that picks up. If you want to see what happened next, waggles the air quotes, to these guys, watch Kenobi, because it does give you a Ben in a very different mindset and a very different place, and all the promises essentially that are made on the Tantive 4 of I'll teach you how to commune with Qui-Gon, I'll teach you this, I'll teach you that. One question I've got, what's happened to Yoda? Has Yoda lost contact with the Force? He's clearly not been in touch with Ben at all. So there's no communication there. I'm wondering if they ever do a season 2, which I really hope they do, or a second limited series. I really hope they do that. I can't see how you couldn't have at least some contact with Yoda, because that's a big question for me. It's like, what's happened to Yoda? Why isn't he been in contact with Ben? Ben's clearly just been cast adrift. As self-reliant as he clearly is, he's had a whole life. I think I had a brother and my mother and father, and he's mentioned a family. The Jedi were his family, and it all went in a day. Yeah, everything he knows is gone. How has Yoda not in any way been in contact with him? Certainly not for years, maybe initially, but certainly not for years. So there's questions there. There's questions about how Bail survives and manages in the Senate when anyone with a brain can see he's essentially a member of the rebellion, a separatist from the Empire, if you want to put it in those terms. So there's lots of little questions there. Leia's now on the galactic map. Kind of feel like she's going to progress, and there's loads of things that sort of take you forward. So I would say it answers a lot of questions. It's left me with a lot of questions. I'm a Star Wars fan. I like questions. I go away with this thinking, I want to know this now. I want to know this now. I hope there's a book about this. Please do a comic about that. I want more from this era. There's characters. I want to see what Roken does. I want to learn more about Tala's past up to where she flicked the thermal detonator last week. There's characters I want to know more about. And even though I'm slightly dissatisfied with how they played it, I want to know more about Reva. So there's lots of questions left.
And I think that's probably not a bad place, really, is it? If everything gets kind of completely wrapped up now, it would not work in the overall kind of theme of what Lucasfilm, I think, is trying to do, and which is create and expand the franchise. And so I think you're going to have these kind of series where they're going to answer some questions and give us some kind of backstory, but they have to then offer new perspectives, new characters to then run with subsequent stories. Otherwise, the galaxy is going to start to feel even smaller than it probably already does now. But maybe in 10 years' time, we can look back and go, oh my God, it's amazing how we've managed to get 4 seasons of a Reva show, or like, you know, that Darth Vader series that we got, and that's spun something else off, and, you know, suddenly, you know, and that's kind of now resonating. You know, for all we know, Reva goes to ground, and we don't see her until like 15 years after Return of Jedi. And then suddenly we've got like a whole different story with a character that we know from one era brought back into a different era, and it's a completely different thing. There's so many avenues that you can go down. I'm really happy that we had a chance to see it, and I think Kenobi's story itself has just been worth watching alone, and I can't wait to try and basically get a day where I can just sit down uninterrupted and just binge all parts 1 to 6 back to back, and just see how it kind of lines up. Because I personally, for one, feel like this could almost have been like a film, but you could have just cut, like, you know, add a commercial break. They've gone on a singular story rather than episodic stories, which is why it's parts rather than episodes. And I think that's really worked for this show. The fact that we've seen Darth Vader and Kenobi face off against each other again is amazing, because it's great seeing it in comic books, and it's great kind of seeing it when you're playing it on computer games, but actually seeing it on live action and seeing the emotional distress that both characters end up causing each other, I think it's been fantastic. So it's been well worth it. And hopefully Qui-Gon is the one who has been speaking to Yoda, so might be able to fill Kenobi in on what he's been up to. So for now, anyway, I think it's time that we leave it. So thank you very much for listening today. And of course, if you want to listen to Mark and myself again, please tune in to Making Tracks, which drops every Tuesday. We have listeners' questions, and you're always welcome to send in your thoughts and theories for anything from this Kenobi series or anything that we're going to get anytime soon. So Mark, do you let the listeners know how they can get in touch?
If you want to be a part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit panthertracks.com or check out the free free Panther Tracks app through the App Store to follow us on your mobile device. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@panthertracks.com. Like Mark says, anything about Kenobi, anything about anything really, we'll talk about all of it on the main show. And as you say, we'll be back at the end of August for our Andor reaction chat. Comment, like and share on any of our social media feeds at Panther Tracks, and be sure to subscribe, leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. And as always, thanks to James Temple for composing the Panther Tracks intro, Annabelle Bryan for our Making Tracks opening music, and Mark Daniel and Vanessa Marshall for our voiceovers. Remember, tune in to Good Morning Tatooine. It's live Sunday evenings, 9 o'clock UK, 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific, on Facebook and YouTube. There's a new episode tomorrow. It's the final Good Morning Tatooine look at Kenobi, so check that out. And also check out Panther Tracks Radio Fridays at 7 o'clock UK time for new episodes of The Panther from Down Under, Planet Leia, Desert Planet Discs, Start Your Engines, and Cannon Fodder. And this week, it's episode 61 of The Panther from Down Under, and that's me done for this episode and for Reaction Chats over on Kenobi.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, mate. It's been a pleasure, and I can't believe it's actually the end. It doesn't feel like we've done 6 episodes, and that's actually because we didn't, because we did a very compressed first episode. However, that is just the nature of sticking series out around celebration time.
Yes.
But, you know, you can't complain. And so until next time, which will be for Andor, look after yourselves, everybody. Listen to the rest of your fantastic Panther Tracks radio offerings, and of course, stay safe, take care, may the Force be with you.
Coming up next on Panther Tracks Radio, it's the Panther from Down Under.
Hello there.